Now let's lay the groundwork to deeply understand your baseline reality layer. Because when you start reality shifting, you will go back to home. You will go back to home base where you're anchored into. And when you're not reality shifting, but you want to be reality shifting, you're going to want to try to be getting away from your baseline reality. And so by understanding this deeper, and I've mentioned it before in the episode Neurohacking Your Baseline Reality, I talk about it at this high level, but now I want to deep dive with you in detail so we can start to really unpack where it is that you're predominantly anchored into. Let's think about your development as a human being. When you started as a little baby, personality psychology theory will say that you have a little personality that you're born with. And for the most part, this is true. This has been scientifically verified. There are other people who say that nature and your environment plays a bigger role in who you become as a person. So there's this really big debate in developmental psychology, or at least there used to be. I haven't checked in on the field recently, but when I was getting my undergraduate in psychology, we had a whole class dedicated to this. And so there's this big back and forth about how much nature plays a role, how your parents treat you, where you're raised, what culture you're from, versus your genetic predisposition. And we do know that there is a genetic predisposition of personality with twin studies. So we know that there is some ratio contribution of actually both. But what's complicated is that you as a baby versus one of your siblings, non-twin siblings, may be impacted differently by your environment and by your personality template. So let's say you are 30% your genetic template, whatever's been inserted, whatever archetype you carry, and then 70% comes from your experience with your environment and your interpretation of the environment. And then some of you will say, your genetic predisposition will affect your interpretation of the environment. And I would say you get an A+ on the exam if I was giving the lecture, because you're absolutely right. It feeds into each other, and it's really impossible to actually untangle them completely. But there will be, let's say, your sibling who will have the reverse. And so there's this big question mark about what proportion each individual is actually impacted by their parents, their upbringing, versus their personality template. And it's kind of a mystery that is, last I checked, unsolved. And so now we know that as a little baby, you have this feed forward, convoluted experience of an innate sense of who you are. Maybe your sun sign in astrology. It's actually way more complicated than that, as many of you know. And so you have this archetype persona that is within you. And then your environment will impact that. And then your interpretation of the environment will feed into that. And so it creates this little machine of personality that you experience reality with. Now, when you're young, everything is decided for you. So it's questionable to what degree you're really creating reality as in the captain of your world, because for a long time, even the most liberal parents still go shopping, even if they let you pick some stuff, right? They're still the ones that are in charge. They decide what school you go to, where they go to work. Their decisions filter down and affect you. And even if they give you a high degree of autonomy as a child, they are still predominantly creating the structure of your life for which your impact is limited. So for a while you're growing up, you're not really creating your reality as much as you are responding to the reality that is being created with you. And even if you can co-create with your family and co-create with your parents, their decisions at the end of the day overrule yours. Now, at some point in development, and usually this is a transition if you're coming from the United States school system, and everything is changing there too. So, depending on when you're listening to this recording, it's recorded in 2023, things could change. But as we are transitioning from elementary school to middle school, this is when we start to care a lot about our peers and fitting in. This is also when the self-consciousness starts. So pre-adolescence into adolescence, you really, really start to feel yourself. You feel any differences. Those become magnified. This is also when people are bullied, usually for the first couple of times, although it can happen in disturbed students. It can happen from disturbed students in elementary school, but middle school is really where you start to have a self-image that was generated by your family and your relationships with your family. And then it starts to become permeated by your peers, even more than ever before. And it did impact you in elementary school. Like, why does this family have that and we don't? Or why do they get to do that? And, it's like understanding you by understanding how other people are working. But your sense of normal is really derived from your upbringing, from that convoluted machine of your experience of the reality. And so in middle school, you start to have the pressures of wanting to fit in, and you start to really feel any differences. You might start looking at your nose. You might start looking at the quality of the things that you own in relation to your peers. Whatever the outside value system is that tells you how to fit into an in-group, you're going to feel that emotionally at a more accentuated point in middle school. And then you shift into adolescence and teenage years, and whoa, what a wild ride, right? Like, phew, there's not one person that makes it out of that experience unscathed. Everybody has an intense experience and a profound experience. So then there's a lot of variations of what can happen depending on which groups you attach yourself to and which cliques you are trying to fit into. I remember, for example, teaching myself to like certain music because I was trying to be in the weird groups, and they have different names depending on what eras we're talking about. So I'll just leave out the names because it's not really relevant, but I was trying to be part of the outsiders. And to be part of the outsiders, I had to learn to like music that I didn't really like. And then I, only wanted to shop at certain stores and had a certain style, and you adopt the behaviors of the peer group that you are trying to fit into. And in individualistic societies, this is a very profound effect that by the time you finish your teenage years and by the time you go on to college, you're really psychologically separating from your family. And this is a cultural phenomenon that is part of the social maturation experience. Whereas if you are in a collectivist society, this is a little bit different. The collectivist societies are like societies or cultures, microcultures in Asia, Latin America, Africa too, I believe, and other parts of the world, versus individualistic, highly competitive societies like the United States or Western Europe, where people have to reject their family. And this is part of a maturation process that is very normal. So you rejecting your family might be acting out in rebellious ways. If you grew up religious, you might become atheist. If you grew up conservative, you might become liberal. And so you go to the opposite side, and it can express itself in your unique ways, but it's a very normal part of development. And then now we're into adulthood, and although this is also changing with the current events. So now we're at the point where you have the ability to create reality. And you are now the culmination of all of your memories, all of your experiences, all of your trauma wounds, every personality characteristic that you've grown, that you've hidden, that you've accentuated to try to fit in to where you wanted to fit in. It's really about navigating social constructs. And you are early in this process of learning how to say the right things to get the things that you want, how to be the right whatever it is, how to have the best right fitting resume to get the job that you want. And you're learning how to construct yourself in such a way to get what you want. But this is still almost like a disempowered position, because you are responding to this set of ideals you have in your mind about what you think you should become. And it's most prominent in dating, depending on your early experiences with relationships. By this point in adulthood, if you've had a little bit of experience or even a lot of experience, then you have a set of behaviors that you trained yourself to do in order to be liked and loved and sought after. And very often it's coming from this very deep insecure place. A lot of people, I was going to say most, but I don't know if that's actually true. A lot of people are unconscious about this process, and they carry that with them for their entire lives. And we have to break it down in our coaching. If you do coaching with me, and not everybody does, sorry. I've got to remember my audience here. Sorry. So it's an important part of the journey of when you start creating your own reality, for reasons that I'll mention in a little bit. So now you are the construct of everything: your environment, your parents, your personality. You are creating reality in the sense that you make your own decisions and you are executing on your free will. But I would argue that at this point in the developmental cycle, you're not actually free. And so the reality that you're creating, that you're waking up every day and creating as part of your baseline reality, is tethered to these ideas of how you think you're supposed to be very often. And then when you start to become conscious, when you start to awaken, you pause for a moment and you start to examine your behavior. And very often this comes from heartbreak, failure, or implosion in your life. Some people might even say the dark night of the soul. And so when you have a profound loss or a tower moment, this creates this examination period where you go into yourself and you ask yourself, why did this happen? How do I prevent it from happening again? It's just like little babies. We learn from pain. You know, it was remarkable how my little one literally was trying to eat spiders. I'm like, no, not the spiders. You know, like she's just crawling around on the floor and she sees a bug and she's like, let me try to put it in my mouth. And I'm like, I have to teach her not to be friends with spiders, because some of them bite, and some of them bite really horrifically, right? She doesn't know that. Same thing with the stove. I had it preheating, and I don't have an insulated stove. I didn't understand what that meant until she put her hand on it and burned her hand. And it wasn't open, and it wasn't like she put her hand on the burner. It was actually just the oven preheating. And she put her hand on the door. And so she didn't even know what hot was. She was fine. It was superficial. But of course I freaked out, right? Because I'm the caregiver and I'm like, no, it's like this really intense moment. And so there is a certain point that you learn by pain, or your caregivers screaming, no. And if you listen to them, if that's part of your base personality, then you can avoid some painful lessons. But if you don't listen, like I wasn't a very good listener, I had to learn things the hard way and on my own. That was part of my baseline personality, apparently. And I'm happy about that, but that meant that I had to go through a lot more challenges than I think was absolutely necessary. And so we learn through pain. It is one of the strongest learning tools. And we are most motivated by love or intimacy and the variety of forms that comes in. And so that creates this situation in our lives where we learn the most and the fastest by going through failed relationships, heartbreak, emotional traumas. And that's when we really start to examine ourselves, because that's the fuel for the fire. Otherwise, we just sort of stay complacent. Or we learn by failure, by not achieving what we want to. And then that feeding into us a sense of loss or a sense of wanting to prove ourselves in the world. That's also very common. And these are all consciousness traps, in my opinion. But I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole. For now, I want to just say that at some point in your awakening journey, you realize that you are a product of all of your experiences that you've had before. And when you start making some pretty heavy mistakes in your life, that's when you stop and you start to examine yourself. There are those of you that are more wise than most people, and you don't have to go through pain to learn lessons. And so for those people, the ride is a little bit easier, I would say, because you don't have to have the full-blown life-destructive blow-up moments to make adjustments. I applaud you. I'm there now. I didn't used to be. When I was a train wreck, I definitely wasn't. And so now we understand the average human. And the average human from this point on very often lives out their entire lives just doing the same thing over and over, but with different people. And when they're unconscious, like ideally we're shifting into a reality where most is not the appropriate qualifier. Where I'm from a binary society, most people are still relatively unconscious, but this is changing. So again, 2023, shifting into a quantum upgraded society. So let's leave open the possibility that this shifts as well. And so now people are just repetitively waking up. They like the same stuff. They eat the same food. They go to the same type of movies. They meet the same type of people. They drive the same type of cars. They have the same type of routines. They are who they are. They like the same radio stations. Is that even a thing still? Like they read the same type of books. They are crystallized in their identity, which means that their reality is crystallized as well. They have a web around them of people that they know that are predictable, they're predictable, and so it creates this reality feedback loop that their baseline reality, it is like I got, when I was a COO for a late stage education startup, I got really, really into financial projections because I found that you could predict what was going to happen And you could model it, you could actually model it with these like very intricate models. And based on what was happening in Q1, you could sort of figure out what was happening in Q3. And I just loved it so much. And I would create these projection curves to understand different facets of the business. And reality shifting from a baseline reminds me of a projection curve. It's like you are the culmination of all of your decisions that have come before. And so now the curve is sloping upwards, and it is relatively predictable over the course of your life based on the structure of where you've come from. But when you start to awaken and you start to change things about yourself, you change the curve and you can shift it to the right or to the left. Or it can take a nosedive into the ground. I did that for a while. That's also an option. And so what happens is that you are relatively predictable, even your quote unquote free will, when you are unconscious, almost down to your death date. We can predict what your life is going to look like. Even if we can't predict the details, we kind of get it, right? Think about like a relative, an older relative, because I think this is changing too. And they kind of like, when you go and hang out with them and you have like family events and you're catching up with them, it can be like 5 years later and you're like, hey, Uncle Bob, how's it going? And then the conversation is the same, right? Because they are so fixed in who they are that it's like you follow the same protocol and they are the same. And so it's kind of like that, where when you're heavily, heavily entrenched in your baseline experience, you're the same year after year, and people will see you 10 years later. You'll go to like your high school reunion. People still do that. And then they'll be like, wow, you haven't changed at all. And I would say that your baseline reality is relatively unchanged as well. And hopefully it's working out for you and you are over the moon enjoying your life, Hopefully you're not just like mind-numbingly going through life like a lot of unconscious people do. Now, that's not going to be most of my listeners. And so now let's think about the reality shifter. Your baseline reality before you've really awakened to reality shifting, or when you're very early on the journey, is going to be that fixed line that is like you are the product of your previous life. That is what you are most likely going to be anchored into for a while until you break away. And upcoming episodes will talk about de-anchoring and techniques to do that. But for right now, it's really important to just understand that you, as the culmination of how your family sees you and how you've been before, who you've been before, that is your snapback reality. And so when you start to reality shift, what you're going to find is that you're going to start breaking away from that lifeline. And at first, it's going to be a small little nudge most of the time, unless you're doing some heavy, heavy shifting. And there's some of you that are, and you've reached out to me, and it's kind of fun. So this example may not apply to you because you're like shifting curves entirely. And so for the beginning reality shifter, you're pushing your curve a little bit off the projected track. And the delta at first for that, the change between the two curves, is really, really small, almost imperceptible at first. But as you start to change and become conscious of the unconscious patterns that you have, and any childhood wounds and any patterns that are subconsciously creating your reality line in a direction that you don't want to go, or in a nightmare, or keeping you stuck. Like, once you do the shadow work, then your baseline reality is going to change. But at first, you're not going to know it because the change is going to be so small. And so then over time, what happens is this really interesting effect called the vacillation effect, where you are going to eventually break off and build a new curve, or completely shift very far away from the original projected curve, such that you could like take a ruler, if you were mapping this out on paper, and measure the delta in like inches. And it's kind of arbitrary, but I have a vision in my mind as I'm saying this. And so what happens is that now you are in the new baseline reality, or the new self, and the old self. And something really peculiar happens, that you flip back and forth between the lifelines, particularly if you are tethered to soul contracts that you're trying to break, or if you have a stimulating event that sort of pulls you back, like the past will tempt you back, or you go to that family reunion and just being in the presence of your family, you shift back into your old identity. And so you shift back into your old reality. And then you leave that event, and then you realize that your accent has come back and your mannerisms have come back, and then you morph back into your new self. And there's this period of a dance back and forth as you are starting to go through a major change, a major personality change, or a major life change, whatever the major change is. Before you're stabilized in a new reality layer, that snapback and vacillation is very, very normal. And a lot of people don't talk about this. And you don't have to have this effect, but if you do have this effect, then just know that it is in fact part of the process as you are stabilizing into a new reality layer and anchoring into that reality layer. Because what I have observed with shifting realities in a variety of different ways is that when you make a shift, that anchoring doesn't keep you tethered for a long time at first. At first, it might just be a couple seconds. And then it might be a couple of minutes, and then it might be a couple of hours. And then you build up to it over time. And it's actually a really complicated methodology that I've found, in that it's kind of like a dance, and you have to feel it out. And then, do you like it there? Do you not like it there? Then you have a demanifestation period, or you double down if you're like really trying to get there. It's not something that you can just leap to a new reality layer and then expect to stay there for the rest of your life. It's a process of a shifting of lifelines. And so by understanding your development cycle and where you've gotten stuck along the way, then you can understand where, if anywhere, your reality layers have gotten stuck. And by utilizing what we've already talked about, like understanding your roles and your identities and morphing into new roles and identities, then you can practice shifting and building new reality layers. And if you are interested in working one-on-one to go through this process, I'm happy to have a coaching session with you, or a weekly deep dive, or series, or some combination of both of those. You are welcome to reach out to me at sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com. Okay, we'll talk next time.